It was a warm, late spring morning, just before solstice, filming on a tree for lands within the beautiful Fort Qu'Appelle Valley. And we were grateful to speak with Dr. Gregory Cajete, Tewa from Santa Clara Pueblo, New Mexico, about how Indigenous science is truly the OG, original science, and his life work of weaving together Indigenous and Western science. We spoke about the connections between corn, seeds, and the cosmos, biophilia versus biophobia, creation stories in science, being in relationship with plants and animals, sun daggers and moon daggers, and the Solstice Project, and quantum thought. So without any further ado, it is such a pleasure and an honor for me to introduce the legendary Dr. Gregory Cajete. I'm so grateful to have you here today. As we're here on beautiful Treaty 4 and Fort Qu'Appelle between, the Echo and the Mission Lakes, which is a beautiful area. And I'm just so honored to speak with you. You have inspired so much of my work with the book Native Science and so many of your other books, and really allowed me in my early career to be able to validate Indigenous science as science. Yeah. So with that, please, if you'd like to introduce yourself in your own way.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me into this conversation. It's an honor and pleasure to do that. And remembering back when we first met, I remember, your excitement about learning, that there actually is a way to talk about another kind of science, Indigenous science, Native science. And so I just commend you for continuing to do this kind of work in the context of, especially now for younger people who really are just beginning to have the notion that there can be some other ways of knowing, understanding, and also reconnecting to their own ancestral identity, that there is a history of, and a very rich and powerful history of Native science that should be, accessed, especially by the younger generation. As they move forward, with this kind of knowledge, this kind of perspective. So my name is Greg Cajete. My full name is Gregory Anthony Cajete. I am from Santa Clara Pueblo, which is one of 6 Tewa-speaking pueblos north of Santa Fe. We are most noted for being the group of tribes that led the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, which drove the Spanish, which had colonized New Mexico for 100 years back to, or had colonized New Mexico, but forced them to go back to Mexico for a period of time and regained our sovereignty as communities. And so when they came back, they had a new respect and somewhat of a fear for that revolt to happen again. So that was a reconstitution of the relationship that we had with the Spanish. And I think that really, as tribes in the United States, that allowed us to maintain our homeland, to keep our homeland, and also to keep our communities intact. And that has continued to be one of our strengths, that community and not being removed from our homelands. So that today we are, continue to practice our traditions, our language, pretty much like we have always done. But that being said, that doesn't mean that we haven't been impacted by language loss or by another kind of colonization, which I call modernization.
Oh gosh, yeah.
So that we are now really dealing with kind of the impacts and the aftermath of that, just as other tribes, throughout the United States, Canada, are involved in various aspects of reclaiming parts of themselves. In our case, it's just that they haven't been practiced. And so we're finding ways to re-practice certain kinds of things that we've always done.
Yeah. And that's having that connection with land and growing up on the land. And that's how you kind of got into this. You've always been experiencing Indigenous science on the land.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, my family, my extended family, and I have to give particular credit to my grandmother. We have always been farmers. And so, my connection to plants, for example, I ended up, getting a degree in plant biology. But I think that interest in plants and interest in nature and being out in the natural world was really facilitated by my grandmother, because I spent a good time with her, in her household. And it was a real learning experience, because I accompanied her to, we have what we call feast days. So various, one of the things that we had to do it was to convert to Catholicism, or at least outwardly.
Yeah.
And that was also, there's a huge story about that in terms of the strategy that also maintained us as very specific communities. But in any case, I grew up in a context where I was always involved with, I was always outside. I was always doing something with plants or with animals. I was always in the gardening, or we were a part of this agricultural cycle that all the families in the community, were a part of as well. Planting and harvesting, and then in between we would have different kinds of dances, ceremonial dances, that would commemorate all of the different stages of growing corn. And I mean all of the different stages, from the planting to its harvesting and its celebration. So that was a part of the calendar, the traditional calendar.
That was all based on corn cycles, the calendar.
Yeah, and then of course, there is a process to farming, and different kinds of things you do different times during that cycle. And so, and to me, that was just the way we did things. It was not. I wouldn't consider it special knowledge until later on in my life, but it was a special kind of knowledge.
It's amazing.
And in that, of course, how to use plants for food and medicine. Besides the plants that you grew, there were just a gamut of other plants that were collected for varieties of purposes and reasons, for medicine, to make salves, to eat as a part of your regular meals, to make teas from, to do traditional dyes, for example. So all of those kinds of things were things that I learned at a very early age, really as soon as I could get out and company. We would go on herb walks and different kinds of things, because the gathering happened during different times of the season where the plants were ready to be collected. So I think that was the major, for me, kind of the forming, I guess you would say, conditioning, for not only being interested in plants, but just, interacting, participating with that process that we as a community and as a family participated in terms of nature and the cycles of nature.
Yeah, and being a part of that.
Right. So I consider myself lucky to have grown up in that kind of context, and I think that really did influence my interest in science. I did very well in science in school, and I think that was one of the reasons why, is because I had a kind of innate interest in learning more about the natural world, and because I had that foundation, which really is I think one of the essential kinds of understandings, is that you have to create a foundation, or have a foundation, or facilitate a foundation for students to really begin to have an internalization a kind of a passion to learn about the natural world. I think that we all have that instinct. I talk about the biophilic instinct in many of my talks, and it's a term that was first used by E.O. Wilson, who was a very famous Harvard ecologist, and they call him the ant-man also because his focus was on ants and how ants really are amazing creatures, and we have in Pueblo tradition a lot of stories about about the ants, yeah. So so that also was, I think, one of the reasons why I used his word, biophilia. And the opposite of that, and I'll talk about it later on in the interview, is biophobia, which is a fear of nature.
So biophilia is the love of nature, the love of the land.
Yeah. And he says it's an innate instinct that we all have. We have an instinct. It's in our DNA to have a propensity to interact with nature. But biophobia has developed in modern times, which is that fear of nature and, power over nature, finding ways which Western science, really in many ways, is a discipline that was designed to find ways to have and to create power over nature. Mm-hmm. Whereas Indigenous science is really participation with nature. So that's the basic difference between the two. And of course, I gained that foundation of participation with nature just by way of my life, in my community, my family. So in school, the science thing was always, I always look forward to that. And I always look forward to art. Yeah, because that was another kind of reinforcement and foundation that I had gained. Because many people in my community, in my family, did art. Mostly pottery, which was done by largely the women at first, but also men started to do it a little bit later on. And of course, pottery is a whole indigenous tradition that's based on clay and based on understanding how to manipulate clay into these beautiful pots and the designs and the symbolism associated with those creations.
And the deep connection with your lands.
And it turns out that, at least for a lot of Pueblo people, in the early 1900s, a lot of Native people would make a living from their traditional art forms. Mm-hmm. And certainly that was the case in New Mexico. Because the train train came into New Mexico and brought tourists, both from the East Coast and the West Coast. And so Native people began to and we had always traded among ourselves, but here was a new population that was interested in things indigenous, at least in our traditional art forms. Mm-hmm. And so I think that also influenced me in my interest in art. And I didn't see, art was really symbolizing, painting, drawing, sculpting, what I was experiencing in nature. So there was a natural balance between the two that I had always seen.
There's such a connection, right?
Yeah.
And to have the early connection, like you're saying, with biophilia, and to having that love of the land and that relationship and understanding the science of plants and plant medicines and even pottery and the chemistry and the
and then of course the creativity.
Yeah.
You see that other kind of instinct that we have, a learning instinct, has to do with creativity. Mm-hmm. And so in Native life, we have a lot of creation stories, how things get to be what they are. And that becomes, another kind of way to talk about this other instinct of creativity that is so much an integral part of both art and science. Mm-hmm. And also the way of being human. in the world. And so I was also gifted with the fact that I kind of intuitively understood that. I didn't understand that intellectually until much later, of course, but intuitively, that kind of like made sense. So it was not a big division, So
Which it is now.
which
so
was
disconnected now.
well, which I realized, as I went on in school, that they put these different ways of being human, doing science or doing creative art into boxes.
Choose one.
and that they had kind of a moat built around them. You were either one or the other, but you couldn't be both, or you couldn't be other things involved with that. Yeah. So it was a very interesting, experience learning. But I have to say that in my time going to elementary school, the elementary school was maybe right over there where those trees are. That's how far it is into the. So for me, it was just another part of my territory.
Yeah. You can learn probably more in those trees than you do in elementary school.
So I was. So I didn't have. I was very quiet, so I didn't talk very much. I listened, which is what I was. My grandmother, you better listen to her once she says you listen. So in other cases, it was really, I think, just that quality of listening and really internalizing whatever was being taught, sort of sponging it up. So I didn't have trouble in school in that academic way, but in terms of things like doing what the teacher wanted in terms of assignments and things like that, I didn't take that seriously. So until I was in the fourth grade, so I was actually a good student in my mind, but until the fourth grade, I didn't really catch on to the game of school.
The game of school.
Which was, do what the teacher says, do the assignments, and put down things that have been said that will be correct.
Get the right answer.
And we'll get
that you've memorized.
Yes.
That you've not experienced.
So so in that time, I would say from the first grade through the fourth grade, I was considered kind of I would say probably a D student. Although to me I knew everything.
You knew it all, yeah.
But I was not articulate in terms of telling that kind of thing until I realized, oh well, this is what it takes to make the grade.
Yeah.
So I'm starting to be academized, at the fourth grade level.
The fourth grade.
Yeah.
So you grew up with the land, with the elders, and is there a time? I mean, could have been when you were growing up, or any time recently, that there was a teaching from an elder or knowledge keeper that was about science that really took you aback, that really surprised you.
Yeah. Well, there's been several of those instances, but I'll go back to my grandmother and her and speaking in the Tewa language. Really, in some ways, reflecting some of the thoughts and perspectives. That plants have a life, plants have a spirit, and you have to be in touch with that spirit, and you have to, greet the plant in certain kinds of ways, and you have to talk to it in order for you to gain the benefit, and the plant to gift you, its essence. And that essence, supports your life, and that you have the responsibility to support the life of those plants. So it's that mutual reciprocal kind of philosophy that is taught to you at a very, very early age. And so this was, I think, one of the most important things that really got me understanding that there is that kind of relational responsibility that needs to be carried not only with plants but with everything around you, everything that gives you life or gives human life, and that is a part of the contract, if you will, between humans and other living things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that hierarchy and the power you were talking about before is the opposite of that.
So with plants, and of course, if you're a farmer, you have animals. So I had a lot of animals. I had, I think I had at one time about almost a dozen dogs and about 7 or 8 cats,
Wow.
and lots of farm animals, goats, chickens, and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So there's that other part of that relationality, first relationship to plants, but relationships to animals as well, and that empathy and that interconnection that you have, that we have with our pets, and also that we should have with the animals that give us life. So those were things, and then of course, if you're a farmer, water then becomes very important, and the importance of getting the water to your field, and ensuring that each plant it gets the kind of water it needs, how much water it needs. And so there's hydraulics that comes into play in terms of understanding how to deal with that, how to work with that. So
Are there like old like natural?
Well, yeah, there's natural springs, but you have to build irrigation ditches, to get that water to your fields, and then of course you have to maintain those ditches. And we actually have that in that cycle, that farming cycle.
In the corn cycle.
Yeah, so you have kind of the ceremony of dancing, those different stages, but there's also a practical aspect of planting, of harvesting, of cleaning the ditches that then feed the fields that you've planted your seed in, and even the seeds, as symbolic representations of a life to begin. So we have ceremonies, seed ceremonies,
Of course.
So all of those things, and of course, different tribes have different ways of doing exactly the same thing, but in their place and in terms of their the place in which you live. So in some cases it's about fish. In other cases it's about hunting. We also have hunting cycles. That take on after plants are harvested. Then you move into that hunting cycle and relationship to animals. So for me, the first book I wrote was called Look to the Mountain, An Ecology of Indigenous Education. By that time, I had gone through, high school and high school science, and which I found fairly easy, but I always, in the back of my mind, realized that they weren't including anything indigenous in that story of science, and so I realized that that was a part that was missing. And at first I said, well, it's missing. But then after a while, I began to question, well, why is it missing?
Yeah.
What is so that got me interested in undergraduate school in sociology, which looks at, social psychology, social interaction, looks at a lot of the kinds of issues of racism, of the nature of culture, all of those social psychologies that we deal with, that sort of obstruct, so you begin to find the reason why there's only one part of a story, and the other part of it is excluded. And so I did a degree in biology at a small college called New Mexico Highlands University, which was really just over the mountain range from where I lived, which was close enough to home so I could always go back and home, when I needed to or wanted to, which I did a lot. And I turned down a lot of offers at East Coast schools and West Coast schools, because I was doing well in school. So I had scholarships, and I chose the one that was probably the least likely for most people, but it was the most amendable for me.
Of course.
And plus, a lot of my buddies were going there too.
That's happening. Of course.
So I ended up going. And I had a pretty good time at a very small college and learned as much, because I figured if you have a good library, you can compensate for most bad teaching that you might receive. But I also had good professors, And so when I graduated, my first position was as a science teacher. I had a degree in biology and sociology, but I also got a minor in education, and I got that as insurance. Not really thinking, well, I'm going to be a teacher. I wanted to be a field biologist too. But I said, well, I'll try it out. And so I was asked, and I think the principal and vice principal of a school that was in the town. The town is Las Vegas, New Mexico.
Okay.
They were probably looking for fresh meat, to accommodate their students, And so I didn't realize, but I was recruited to teach high school biology to ninth graders at this school, and that was in the town. And I hadn't realized that the students had been through two teachers before me.
Oh, no.
That the principals, I was wondering why I was being interviewed by the principal and the vice principal, of the school. And being asked the questions, do you think you can...
Do you think you can handle this?
And once I got in there, I realized 180 students, ninth graders. The books were in shambles. The classroom had very little of no equipment. And I had to teach, 6 sections of...
How long were you there for?
Well, it was in December. See, they had the students...
So in the middle of the school year?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. So that was trial by fire in education, because I had to really pull on all of my, knowledge, and I have to say that very little of that was covered in the education classes I took, It wasn't even mentioned,
Yeah.
But that was the reality of school. So, but the students were actually ranch kids.
Mm-hmm.
They're largely ranch kids, and of course the town kids. But they had there was still a standing tradition of ranching and farming and old traditions of how to use plants and food for medicine and for survival. So there was a knowledge base that I connected to and I knew about. So I used that as the foundation to begin to engage the students in learning about biology. And it was very successful. I began to, because I didn't have textbooks, that were torn pages and, different kinds of things. So that was the start of one of the aha experiences that I had in education, was that whole notion of relevancy and the whole notion that if you teach science, it's science in a way that engages students, not from a textbook, but from their own lived experience, their life experience, and you build that and you begin to engage them in learning about plants and animals and their history. And you begin to engage them by taking them out and having them experience, through, and this is where my art came in, because would have them do illustrated journals of the plants that they were selecting or pick the plants and make plant presses, and then learn about the histories of the uses of those plants in their communities. As it turns out, the kids knew a lot already. It was really just a matter of helping them pull that knowledge forward.
Yeah, for them to realize.
Embellishing it, yeah. And then also saying, but this is science, you know. Relationship to animals, relationship to plants turns into science. The knowledge of science, knowledge of practical knowledge of science. So I was then offered a job at the, how much was I paid? I was paid, in those days, that was like, the whole year salary was $7,000, $7,500 for the whole year. So I was there for half a year, so I got half of that.
Got half of that.
And that was the going salary. So it was about $3,500, $3,600. And then I had done my student teaching at the Institute of American Arts the semester before. And there I was just observing classes, and I was just having fun. I was in art school. So I was, you know, and it was good. And so they asked me back. They asked me to come back and teach at the Institute of American Indian Arts. And there is where I was given the leeway, which is really rare, to actually create curriculum that integrated science with art, with the cultural perspectives of the students that were attending the Institute at that time, which were really tribes from all over, urban native people, you know, from even Los Angeles and Denver. Albuquerque is also an urban native center, and Minneapolis, but also students that were coming directly off the res, also students coming from here in Canada. And so I had kind of the smorgasbord of indigeneity in the form of students. And they had revolted against the prior teacher and the prior way that science was being taught, because it was the old standard BIA, militaristic type of discipline, you know, stuff. And they were art students, and why did they have to have art? And anyway, and a lot of them said, there's no science in art. And I said, well, I beg to differ, and let me show you where it is.
To show them?
Well, that's where I got a chance to develop the whole culturally responsive curriculum in science, you know.
What's the specifics?
1974. Well, you know, I started with what I did with the students at the Las Vegas school. I started with getting a sense of where they were from, their communities, what their communities did, how they lived in their communities. You know, so they had to actually write a story, a kind of a self biography of their experiences in their communities, especially as it relates to plants and to animals and to knowledge about plants and animals. In some cases, the urban students didn't have that much practical knowledge, direct knowledge, but their families had told them stories, you know, their tribal traditions, which they had some connection with also, you know, gave them indication. So they had to do a kind of a self-portrait of themselves, you know, and then from that I began to extract, okay, so I can use, for these students, I can use these examples, I can use that example. But I started with plants, because that's what I knew most about, the plant ecology.
And everyone can relate to that.
And so I started with traditional uses of plants for food and medicine. So that was my first unit. And I drew from what was available in terms of research at that time about native uses of plants for food and medicine. Starting in 1880s and extending all the way to the 1920s, the Bureau of American Ethnology, which was at that time situated in the Smithsonian Institute, had sent out all kinds of scientists, biologists, anthropologists, archaeologists, ethnologists, botanists, you know, all the sciences basically, they had sent them out into Indian country in the United States to gather all of the what they called ethnoscience knowledge of the tribes at that time, because the notion was that in one generation the native people would be gone, they lose that knowledge, that understanding, that perspective. So that was also to employ government scientists. It was the economic thing of employing scientists, to do research in native communities. But they brought back reports. It's called the Bureau of American Ethnology Reports, and on native uses of plants and food and medicine from different tribes. The uses of the different forms of agriculture, the different astronomies that native people had. Yeah. And that formed the record that I could draw from, at least a whole compiled record of native science. But I call it, in those days it was called ethnoscience, because it was not considered a science. It was a part of anthropology.
The other science.
Yeah. So that, along with my own knowledge, I was able to put together a very comprehensive native plants, food, and medicine unit.
Very cool.
And introduced it, and the students just, this is great, And of course, they're painting, they're drawing, they're sculpting those plants. Next one I did was animals, using again the same strategy. Mm-hmm. So again, and the stories about plants, the stories about animals that tribes have, were also incorporated in some way into these reports, these ethnology reports. Then I started to do research in terms of, native philosophies, native communities, native astronomy, which I was interested in. And it turns out students were just crazy about that too. Yeah. And so within a year, I was able to create 7 distinct units on native science. And it was really something that really engaged the students, and even surprising me, because I think even then there was a thirst for that kind of knowledge, and you didn't get it in school or even in university at that time. And if you were going to find it, you're going to have to do the research to actually uncover it, like this Bureau of Ethnology report. And then I asked them, okay, so now you've got to research your own people's traditions in these areas. Like, how did they use plants for food and medicine? How did they interact with animals and hunting? How did they do fishing? Yeah. What were the technologies that they were using to do all of this? What were the traditions that surrounded the use of this, the context? Mm-hmm. And so what happens is that knowledge begins to undulate and it begins to build. And I said to myself, well, this is a holistic way of teaching. So I began to study more holistic forms of education, see how they were doing things, and then I began to look at native philosophy of education. How do people come to know things in a tribe? Mm-hmm. What are the traditions? What are the ways that that's done? And then that led to really devising a kind of curriculum mandala, where the center is the self and the community, and then it expands to include knowledge about plants, knowledge about animals, knowledge about the place you live, and knowledge about the cosmos. And so the realization there is that traditional forms of education are filled with science, and it's really about orienting whomever you are and wherever you are, to the world around you, to the natural world that gives you life and that it sustains you through time and through generations. So, the directions, the north, the south, the east, the west, the above, the center, and below become a kind of structure. And in academic terms, they call this an epistemological structure that organizes what is being learned and when it's being learned and how and why it's important to learn that thing in that place or about those things in those places. So that what's happening there is, as I'm developing this, I'm developing a sense for curriculum, how to actually design curriculum, and how to design an indigenous curriculum that incorporates indigenous values and perspectives and understandings. So, of course, this is taking, sort of from 1974 to 1979, I had a high school class, and all the students at IIA had to take my class, so.
Oh, you had the mandatory course that everybody had to take.
Because they had to pass their science credit. Yeah. And so I was brought in to actually design that credit in a way that they could pass, So in each of those scenarios, I was always teaching the basic science principles associated with, those different aspects. But I was doing much more, and the students were learning much more. Yeah. And because they were using their art and they were using their creative possibilities, and they were getting excited about learning about their own cultural histories.
Became very relational and experiential.
Yeah. And it was hard, but it was also easy at the same time, simultaneously. It was easy now to engage them because they were already engaged. And they just wanted to say, how can we do this? Or what we do this? Or how can we represent this? Yeah. So that led then to a transition from a high school program to a college program, 2-year college program. And so I just took the courses that were units in high school and transformed them into discrete courses. And I called that the ethnoscience curriculum. And so that started in 1980 to, actually that whole decade into the 90s. And of course, the students, now that we're older, they're not in high school. They're not high school students. They're college students. And we had, the average age was probably about 28. And so we had older, mature students, in that college program. And their life experience and their issues and kinds of things. So that really augmented, and most of them, if not all of them, had never been introduced to this kind of curriculum in school.
Even now, a lot of people have not, right? Yeah. After all these years.
So that's kind of the big story, where I get into all of these different kinds of, and I really didn't. I wish I had recorded everything that we had done, but we had so much fun doing it. And the only recordings and pictures that I have of the students doing this work is when the students themselves, the photography students, because we also had photography and videography, they were the ones in class, and they were the ones that were doing the recording. Yeah. And so it's... Have
you talked to any of the students recently? Because that'd be cool. Just talk to your old students.
Most of the students that I meet, which happens during our Indian market in Santa Fe, where
I need to go to that.
Where a lot of the students, they become nationally known Native artists, so they're earning much more than a poor teacher or poor professor who would make in a year. They make in one show.
Wow.
But so I interact with them there, and they remember these courses. These are the courses they remember.
Sure.
The courses they had with when we were going out. The difference also was that I never had more than 13 students in a class.
Makes a huge difference.
And the reason for that was that I could take them in our 13-seat van. So we could actually drive, all around the countryside, come to places like this, look for plants, explore new drawings.
Yeah.
I really didn't write about any of this until, I was getting into my, having to do something for my PhD.
Yeah.
And I said, well, I'll do what I know, which is really this story of creation of a native science curriculum. And it was so new when we first started it in 1974. The students were really excited about what we were doing. We're doing things with the plants and things with animal stories and things like that. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs had a conference in Albuquerque in 1975. And so I loaded my students up in the van. Albuquerque is about 60 miles south of Santa Fe. And we get there and we find the room where we're supposed to present. And maybe it was advertising and maybe it was just, and we called the session Indian Biology. Absolutely no one came to our presentation.
No one.
No one. Nobody. So we ended up having pizza and laughing and talking to ourselves, but
Which is also fun.
but what that showed me was that this concept of native science and native what we call native biology was so new that no one, at least in the Bureau of Indian Affairs educational sphere, knew what it was, or
I wonder what they thought it was.
I don't know. I don't know. No one came. Then look at a bit the time too. They put us like really at the very last of the conference, and so a lot of people had gone home and stuff. So, but it was very, and it took for a long time. I would ask myself, am I the only one doing this? Well, the only one interested in this. I knew my students were. I mean, they were just wanting to take the courses, but not. It was not a part of the narrative, I guess you might say.
Yeah, who are the original? You're one of the OG Indigenous scientists.
Mm-hmm.
There's Vine Deloria. It's around the same time.
Right.
Linda TPY Smith.
Yeah.
What else?
So I guess what that shows is it takes time for an idea to take hold. And so here, segue 40 plus years since that time, and now Indigenous Science is a conference.
Now we're at Indigenous Science Conference here, right? Which is amazing.
So yeah, it's a very interesting kind of journey.
Yeah.
But so I became passionate about, based on the experience I had teaching and working with the students, about going deeper, extending more, and particularly focusing on native science philosophy as kind of the binder from which you can teach just about anything from a native perspective.
Yeah.
In science, and you can actually accommodate almost any Western science discipline with a native content. So I think we're at that stage of really beginning to understand how we can be creative in terms of how we can begin to incorporate, native science into the teaching of Western science, and even going beyond that, saying native science as the foundation from which we attach Western science.
Yeah, the origin.
Needed, needed. Yeah. So that's a huge, and maybe 40 years is not that long, as far as the idea itself, and now it's become prolific, I guess you might say, and it's a part of many conferences, many discussions, and of course also the obstacles and the issues become a part of that as well.
Yeah. One of the things that when I was reading Native Science, one of the things that really struck me was the sun daggers.
Yes.
And how
Yes.
cool that is. And thinking about, how old are those?
My estimate, I'm going to say at least 1,500 years, right, when they were constructed. At least 1,500 years.
Yeah. And you can't go to them anymore, can you?
Well,
You can probably go.
The site itself now requires a special permit, and that's because and she was a photographer. She was assigned to Chaco Canyon, which is a national park, to record the petroglyphs. And there are many petroglyphs in the park, many petroglyphs. And so she happened to be at about 11:30 or so. She happened to be on this butte where she knew there were some petroglyphs, and she began to notice a strange thing happening as the sun was moving in the sky, getting closer to noon. And there were these 3 stones, and behind those 3 stones were these spirals. And she began to see a dagger of light start to form as the sun was moving across, getting closer to high noon. The dagger was getting longer and longer and longer and cutting through the center of that spiral. And of course, this was by accident. She was not a native person. She was a photographer, but creative and observant. So she says, what is this going on? So she filmed it. She filmed the whole thing. And then she shows it to the park people and saying, well, what is that? And then she calls in anthropologists and archaeologists.
The park people didn't know what it was.
Well, they knew where the site was, and they knew that, but they didn't know what was going on with the light and the dagger. Yeah. They had probably not seen it. They just discounted it.
Yeah.
So she says, well, I've got to know more about this. So she starts contacting Native people and talking, and she has photographs and a video of this phenomenon. And a lot of the archaeoastronomers at that time said, no, Native people aren't capable of doing that. They don't have that. How is this happening? It's so...
Because it measures if you want to explain what it
well, it measures the exact time of summer solstice at high noon.
Yeah.
On the register, of the spiral. So there's these spirals, and then there's a smaller spiral, to the left of it. So the spiral is the sun dagger cuts through the center of the spiral during high noon at summer solstice. And during winter solstice, 2 daggers bracket the spiral.
So cool.
And mark the exact time of winter solstice. And of course, anthropologists, because they had never seen it, they hadn't discovered it. Archaeologists, archaeoastronomers, this can't be. There's no place in the world where this happens.
Yeah.
But she, and then she presents her findings to this International Archaeoastronomy Society in England, and they just blow her off. They say this can't happen. You've doctored your photos, and also because she's a woman and she's a scientist. She's not a scientist.
Yeah.
And then she's an artist in the sense of being a photographer.
Yeah.
How can this photographer tell us that this is something? But Native people knew about it.
Yeah. I'm sure there's more around that are similar.
There are.
Yeah.
There are around. So she then went to school. She begins to do write-up. She learns how to be a scientist. And she gets her PhD and then goes back and defends that original
That's
finding.
commitment.
And
Wow.
so she's now the head of the Solstice Project. So the Solstice Project, if you look at the Solstice Project, you'll see all the multiple kinds of things that, and her name is Anna Safir, that she's been able to accomplish, from a photographer, artist, to
That stumbled across
videographer.
something that
Yeah.
was significant.
Yeah.
And now that's
Yeah.
her.
And
Wow.
And now, when they realized this is a watershed moment in archaeoastronomy, so that they said, well, no ancient civilizations were capable of doing that. All of a sudden, they started to find similar kinds of, mechanisms all over the world, ancient sites, where the sun and the summer solstice and the winter solstice were being recorded or marked in a variety of different kinds of ways. The other thing that's unique about the sun dagger is that it also marks the 18-and-a-half-year cycle of the moon.
Okay, I'm curious about this because I don't understand that.
Well, the moon it jumps around. It moves in horizon. If you're taking a look at the horizon, let's say the moonrise,
Yeah.
it takes 18-and-a-half years of time to move in its cycle. And so the little
Does
spiral,
it wobble? It like kind
Yeah.
of goes. Okay. Yeah.
so it rises in a different place in the horizon during different times of the year, and you mark it against the horizon. So I'm looking at this horizon here in front of me, and imagining the moon. So the moon rises gradually in different places, different parts of that on that horizon, and then it gets to a maximum point, and then it actually dances there, what we call dancing, for about 4 days, and then it moves again back to its minimum cycle.
And that's 18 and a half years.
It takes 18-and-a-half years to complete that cycle.
And how do the sun daggers show
From
that?
minimum to minimum, maximum to maximum.
And how's that showing on the sun daggers?
That's shown by a dagger of moonlight, full moon,
Stop.
following the sun in the same position, the full moon, just like the sun.
So there's a moon dagger and a sun dagger.
Creates a dagger of light. But it's not a dagger. It's not so much the dagger like the sun creates. It's actually a shadow. So there's a light part to the shadow, and then there's a dark part to the shadow, but that shadow moves across those spirals. So the best way to do it is actually to access the Solstice Project, and they have the schematics of how this is done, so that people can image it, because it's hard to image if you're not there and you're not seeing it, and you're not used to seeing how the sun moves or how the moon moves across the horizon. And of course, this is time-lapse photography, so you can actually see it. But if you were just waiting for it, you actually have to wait for it. Observe very carefully how that sun or how that moon is moving across the horizon.
Okay.
So this was being done by all tribes in some shape or form.
Yeah.
I mean, so what happened at Chaco was a watershed moment. So they find this, of course, at Cahokia. It's in every complex in Mexico. In Teotihuacan, in Chichen Itza, and then, of course, it extends down into South America, into Machu Picchu. So all of those sites are situated in some kind of, relationship to the sun or the moon. And in the case of the sun dagger, both the sun and the moon. So sometimes it's just the sun, and sometimes it's the moon. And other times it's Venus, which was another star that the native people tracked extensively. Yeah.
Gosh.
So again, so engaging native students, especially when you're talking about, complex subjects like astronomy, and then you get into quantum physics, and you get into all those kinds of theoretical models, and it becomes a real interesting journey. And again, it engages everybody, whether you're a science person or not. I mean, just the recent, just look at how the recent eclipse, how it engaged people just throughout North America. People were just enthralled about it.
Yeah.
So yeah. So I think what really has to happen is really that, and I think the Western science realizes that it's breaking out of its usual box, but it's not, again, offering that opportunity to other cultural traditions. It's exploring them, but very much the way it explored Native culture in Chaco Canyon. It's through a very Western scientific lens. It doesn't include the context, which is just as important as the event, if not more important. The context is that relational, mutual, reciprocal philosophy that guides. It's the thought behind those structures.
And I think that comes back to that biophilia, biophobia that you mentioned in the beginning, and that reconnection with that biophilia.
Yes,
that love and that connection for the land.
Yeah, and for living things, because it's really a realization that
and the cosmos.
Yeah, that we are part of a living, very dynamic living world and cosmos that's constantly changing.
I have one more question that I think because we were saying there's a lot more openness, like you said, to Indigenous or Native science. Those boundaries are being broken. And I also see a lot of tokenism that's happening within Indigenous science, within curriculum, within methodologies. And, a big part of what you talk about and many Indigenous scientists talk about is that the importance of bringing in spirit into science. And I think that's the thing that so many people say, how do we do that? What is a way that is an actionable way that spirit can be brought into science?
Well, I think most Native people would agree that spirit is energy. It would be energy. It would be what scientists call energy, and of course, we live in an energetic world that surrounds us. And I think it has more to do with how you conceptualize that energy. So, as Native people would call it spirit, and the idea that everything has energy, everything manifests energy, everything is in a process of formation of energy, and that energy ultimately is a kind of a light. And actually, the Hindu, for example, refer to this living energy as a light, and different kinds of qualities of light. And that light then manifests into, at various levels, into our experience realities. It turns into matter.
And so it's quantum.
So that's the quantum. And so Native people have always talked about light, and the notion of light as being, and also what's behind the light. There's thought, and that's another kind of energy, but it's also light. So in Pueblo stories, we have the entity that is called Thought Woman. And the parallel to that in Navajo philosophy, for example, is changing woman. But the idea that the world, is manifested or is created first with the thought. The thought is energy. And that energy then turns into variations and forms of light, which is the quantum quality. And then that manifests into everything that we see around us, and that we are also part of that. And we originate that, and we go back to that.
And that connects into the language and that.
And everything, everything has that cycle of light. And so this is what makes the symbolically what makes the Chaco Canyon dagger very symbolic, because it's using light as the manifestation of this quality that we're looking at. Life in its purest form is in that light. The light of the sun in this case, but it's really the light of all the stars and cosmos. And it generates that. So this is why you and I think my good friend and colleague Leroy Littlebear, has
we forgot to talk about Leroy Littlebear, and we're talking about the OGs.
Yes.
Got to mention Leroy.
Yeah. So Leroy has really, he's worked with Blackfoot physics. And he's really delved into many of these ideas about light and about the quantum, and how Native people understood this, languaged it, ritualized it, ceremonialized it, and really understood it as a natural part of life. It was just the way things are, and so it was. So he's bringing to light the nature of, that kind of physics, that kind of native way of looking at things.
And that allows for that connection.
Yeah.
You say, or the validity too of spirit and energy and quantum.
Right. So, one of the key elements of Native philosophy is balance, and maintaining that balance. And if that balance is lost, finding ways to restore it. And so that idea of balance, along with the relationality and interdependence, become kind of the hallmarks of indigenous worldviews, wherever you find them. And for the Western, it's really that material, or the actual product, or the actual, this logic is either or. It's not relational.
Or the end point.
Yeah, and its focus is on the reproducing that element in some shape or form. It's very convenient for a materialistic, capitalistic economic system. But that's I think ultimately a big conflict. It's an oil and water conflict.
Yeah.
And so the two worldviews have been consistently at odds with each other. But now what we're doing and attempting to do is try to find ways for it to begin to come together.
To connect and to balance.
And something out of that, what emerges out of that is a new kind of something. I would call it a new kind of science.
I like what you said yesterday about how this understanding and this relational way of knowing science, Indigenous science, it's not just for Indigenous people. It's for everyone. It should be understood by everyone.
It's inclusive of everything, every living thing, everything in the world. It's not just we have, as Indigenous people, certain ways of describing it and relating to the experience of it, but it's actually all of life experience, that comes into this. And that really is the study. You're asking me, what is science? Science is the study of life, and that life principle, that life that animates everything. And we're dealing with the imbalance of that through what we call climate change. But climate change that we ourselves have instigated. And so you get back to the question of balance, and how do you restore balance into that system? But everything begins with thought. So what is the thought behind what we are experiencing today in modern life? And what is the thought behind Indigenous thinking and process? And so change the thought, change the mind, change the consciousness, and then change the reality. And that's the sequence, that we have to do once again. And what's sad is that we don't teach about this, really. I mean, you may get into this, and if you get a high-level course in theoretical physics, or high levels of ecological philosophy, or kinds of things. But most people are not introduced to any of this. And I think it's a kind of knowledge that has to be shared and become extensive, because in a lot of ways, all of our ancestors practiced this in a direct way. There was a thought behind, there was and what I call mindfulness, a mindfulness about what they did. And the mindfulness is nothing more than paying deep and close attention to something, and to understanding it in this close and as much as you can. And that's mindfulness. So mindfulness is not new to Native people. Everything, a place like, as I said, of Chaco Canyon, of Cahokia, or Machu Picchu, any of those places would not have existed without the understanding of the thought behind it. You have to understand the thought behind that. So the focus, the Western focus of science is on the actual materiality of Chaco Canyon, of Machu Picchu. My interest is the thought that gave rise to that, and to multiple other things. But I think we have to capture something of the essence of that thought in Western science, to begin to understand the indigenous view of science.
Certainly.
And I think that comes down to how we educate, what we educate for, and creativity in our thinking, and our willingness to face the obstacles that have come into the way of that, the mindlessness. A lot of Western economics and a lot of the Western world. You really think about, let's say, you were an alien coming from a different planet. There is a film series called The Alien. You should see it. It's really interesting. And the alien is acting like he's an observer. He's come to conquer the earth and take it over. But it's very, very interesting. I'm very happy about it. The writers are very creative in telling kind of the modern story through this sitcom, The Alien.
Okay.
It's on Netflix.
On Netflix. Okay.
Netflix, yeah. So that's really the dilemma we're in. Climate change is going to happen. We've had climate changes before, maybe not to this extent, but it's a human-caused phenomena. We have to learn how to adapt to it. The talk is not mitigating it anymore. It's actually adapting to it.
Yeah.
Native people are extremely good at adaptation if we put our creative minds to it. And I think in many ways we are adapting, as time goes by. And I think that, as we move forward, we have to really concentrate on how we educate for this adaptation, drawing from our own histories, but moving forward with our own creative potential and possibilities. And Western science can be very productive for Native people if we use it with our own sense of thought. In ways that really are life-supporting, as our traditions have always manifested, So that's the new science, And
new science.
And I think it's evolving as we speak, but it certainly is going to take the participation of Native people.
And everyone.
And just as my students were extremely resistant against learning Western science, learning about Native science became their forte. And I think we have to encourage that, to happen in a much wider level, not only among our own Indigenous peoples, but among non-Indigenous people as well. And I think that's beginning to happen. It's beginning to happen. Yeah. So that's my hope for the future.
It's my hope too.
Yeah.
Well, this has been an absolute pleasure. I cannot tell you how this is the best day on the land, having a conversation with you, hearing the birds in the background. So I am so grateful. So thank you so much for your time
You're certainly
and your
welcome.
stories and your knowledge today. And
You're certainly welcome.
thank you again.
Yeah. As we say, be with life. Yeah.
Be with life.
It's a very simple concept, you know, and you just be with life.
Until we meet again.
Yes.